People think the desert is empty. It isn't. It's just good at pretending. I took the graveyard shift at Helios 3, a decommissioned solar thermal plant 50 miles past the last decent diner, out where the highway quits and the sky decides you've had enough light for one lifetime. We used to boil salt with sunlight here, 10,000 heliostats focusing onto a receiver at the top of a 750-foot concrete tower, sending heat into tanks big enough to drown a house. Power by day, stored as molten salt by night. It worked until it didn't. A, quote, flux, unquote, incident. PR word for we taught the birds what it feels like to be a match head. Now it's mothballed. The state won't let them scrap it yet, and the company won't pay 2 techs when one fool with a tool cart will do. That's me, Miguel Santos. I keep compressors oiled, SCADA trend lines predictable, fences uncut, and coyotes from building a religion around the warm pipes. There's one rule on the night watch. All mirrors parked at STOW, midnight to 6, flat to the ground, face to the stars like they're sleeping. Motors unpowered. No exceptions. On my second week alone, the wind smelled faintly like hot pennies and rain, even though the sky was sandpaper dry. The tower, locals call it the needle, throbbed heat into the night like a heart that forgot it was off. And somewhere out in the field, a heliostat made a tiny, hopeful tick, the sound a stepper motor makes when it tries to move with no juice, like teeth chattering. That's not how dead systems behave. I told myself it was thermal drift, a gust rocking the frames. I logged it as spurious noise. I kept walking. The desert kept pretending. Welcome to Hour 1. 11 p.m. People imagine the desert at night as silent. It's not. It hisses. It breathes. Even when there's no wind, the air feels like it's moving sideways through your teeth. I stood in the middle of Helios 3, 10,000 mirrors stretched flat across the desert floor. They were all supposed to be at STOW, parked, sleeping, turned toward the stars. The company line was simple. This place was dead. The solar thermal experiment ended after a flux incident, polite jargon for we burned daylight into something it wasn't supposed to touch. Since then, the tower, locals call it the needle, just stood, a 750-foot concrete tomb with its red aviation beacon pulsing like a tired heartbeat. But things that are dead still leave behind echoes. That's why I was here. I'm Miguel Santos, night tech, babysitter for steel ghosts. First walk. At 11:02, I wheeled my cart through Sector D South, past a pyroheliometer no one but auditors cares about. Its logger blinked green, claiming no flux, yet the graph said different, a tiny bump at 1017, like a moth had carried a candle flame through the sensor. I chalked it to noise, made a note in my book, but my hand shook more than I liked. The air smelled like hot pennies, a copper tang you only get when transformers are bleeding, but the main lines were cold. The tick. At 11:13, I heard it, a tick, not wind, not sand against glass, not the creak of steel. A stepper motor, polite as a metronome, trying to move when it shouldn't. Heliostat D613. I put a hand on its gearbox. It was warm. SCADA swore the bus was dead. Numbers said no.
My palms said yes. I backed up to see the row. D613 shivered a degree north. Then D614 followed, then the whole line, one after the other, like dominoes tipping. The receiver. The tower should have been dark, dead concrete, but when I lifted my IR camera at 11:23, I saw filaments, thin white lanes of heat in the air, braiding upward, converging on the receiver. Heat paths in a night with no sun. The shroud temperature ticked up, 45 degrees Fahrenheit, 52 degrees Fahrenheit, 58 degrees Fahrenheit, numbers climbing when they had no right to. The writing. By 11:40, I was back on the slab, looking up. The tower's surface, chalked with old scorch, caught the red aviation blink. For a heartbeat, I swore I saw letters in the dust, like daylight scars rearranging. Don't A-L, the rest smeared out in shadow. When midnight hit, the mirrors shifted again. Thousands of square faces tilted east-northeast toward a patch of sky with nothing in it. Motors dead, but geometry alive. The air changed, not warmer, not colder, just aligned. I logged it like a man carving his own headstone. Hour 1, 2300 to 0000. D south, synchronized ticks at 17 and top of the hour. Receiver skin temp climbing, baseline plus 11 degrees Fahrenheit. IR shows filaments converging on SE shroud. Pyroheliometer readings at night, 0.3 watts per meter squared. Visual artifact on shroud, don't A-L. The desert pretended nothing was happening. The mirrors disagreed.
12:04 a.m. The plant was awake in a way machines don't wake. Screens in the control trailer swore everything was fine. Every heliostat STW equals true. Every motor bus off. Every field log normal. But in the raw angle data, numbers whispered otherwise. Step counters advanced when nothing should have powered them. Each one nudged east, then higher, as if the glass itself had a pulse. I wrote them down the old way, pen scratching paper. D613 at AZ 68.2 degrees, EL 11.1 degrees. D614, same. D706, same. Thousands of tons of glass agreeing on a single point of sky, east-northeast, 11 degrees up, crawling left to right by fractions. That's not drift, that's tracking. The smell of rain. The air carried a smell that shouldn't exist in April desert nights. Rain on dust. My tongue tasted it before my nose did. Petrichor laced with ozone, sharp and metallic. The pyroheliometer chirped. 0.7 watts per meter squared at 0.6. That's past random noise. That's measurable energy. Stops don't stop. I trudged out to D613 and D614 with a wrench and old-school faith. Dropped a manual stop block on each yaw shaft, so even if phantom code tried to move them, dumb steel would stop dumb steel. I tightened bolts until my hands ached. I muttered, "Try that." At 12:17, the line of mirrors stepped again. Stops pressed hard, didn't budge, yet the glass tilted anyway, a degree higher, faces moving without mechanics, like muscles under skin. The tower's message. I climbed. Third landing up the east stair, I turned back. 10,000 sleeping mirrors were no longer asleep. They all canted together, lifting their faces toward the same empty wedge of sky. At the receiver, faint glow gathered.
not bright, but visible, a bruise-colored shimmer pooling on the lower right shroud, the same panel that carried old scorch scars. And then I saw the letters again, drawn not with paint, but with heat rearranging dust. Don't aim. The first scorch. At 12:41, my boot hit a stair tread wrong. I glanced down. There, on the underside of a galvanized step, where no daylight ever touches, was a perfect scorch mark. A coin-sized burn circle, metal dulled to gray with a dime-bright center. I touched it, warm. The IR gun read 119 degrees Fahrenheit. The rest of the stair, 48 degrees Fahrenheit. Geometry couldn't explain it. The heat had found its way here from nowhere. The tanks stir. The South Molten Salt tank steamed again. The crown temp rose to 92 degrees Fahrenheit, then 104 degrees Fahrenheit. Condensate climbed upward on the sight glass like water fleeing gravity. Steel doesn't drink. Tonight, steel did. The radio crackled alive. Miguel, a line. My name. Then the order. Male voice, too close to the mic, swallowed by static. I didn't answer right away. When I did, it came out hoarse. Aligned to what? Static, then a long, satisfied exhale. The dust light. I triangulated the mirror's vectors on the tablet, cross-checked with a star map. They all pointed to the anti-solar point, the spot opposite the sun, empty sky, cataloged nothing. Then I switched the star chart to night mode, red on black. A faint dotted patch appeared around those coordinates, labeled Gegenschein, counterglow, dust light, so faint only photographers brag about seeing it. Helios 3's mirrors were collecting dust light and turning it into heat. The hour turns. At 1 a.m., the field shifted smoother than before, like practice was paying off. The receiver flared a little brighter, heat crawling higher into the shroud seams. This time the dust letters dropped the warning. No, don't, just one word. Align. And my notebook, lying open on the desk, had a new line in pencil I hadn't written. Next hour, it answers back.
1:04 a.m. The desert's quiet had changed. It wasn't silence anymore. It was listening. My own bootsteps came back too sharp, like the sand was repeating them under its breath. Every squeak of the cart, every crack of a glove sounded amplified. The plant wasn't just awake, it was waiting. The pyrheliometer chirped again, 1.9 W per meter square at 105. That's measurable flux, more than a candle flame per square meter. With 10,000 mirrors, that's a bonfire no one lit. The South Tank's halo. I circled back to the South Molten Salt tank. The halo of steam I'd noticed earlier had stretched into an oval, no longer round. It pointed east toward the sky patch the mirrors had chosen. At the sight glass, condensation didn't drip down. Droplets climbed upward, racing each other like insects. Against gravity, against reason. I put my face close enough to fog the glass with my breath. That fog didn't fade. It spread upward into the steel rim, like the tank inhaled me. The first burn pattern. At 1:12, the air smelled like scorched zinc. I followed it along the service road until I saw it.
a perfect circle of asphalt melt. About 3 feet wide, tar bubbled, gravel fused into black glass, still warm enough to shimmer. The geometry was impossible. None of the mirrors were aimed at this lane, yet the scorch was there, like the road had been caught under a giant magnifying glass, focused by hands I couldn't see. I bent down, pressed the IR gun to it. 131 degrees Fahrenheit. Asphalt in desert night should be 40. I wrote it down, but the words in my notebook shook. The synchronized breath. At 1:17, the mirrors ticked again. But this time, they didn't just shift politely. 4 rows ratcheted up 10 degrees, glass tilting in unison like soldiers taking aim. The IR camera caught it, white-hot filaments braided upward from the field into the receiver. Skin temp 158 degrees Fahrenheit. The radio hissed alive, not static, breathing, then clear enough to punch my gut. Miguel, a line. I whispered back without meaning to. Aligned to what? The reply was nothing but a long, patient exhale. The tower's words. At 1:29, the receiver shimmered visible to the naked eye. No camera needed. Dust rearranged on its surface, soot streaks glowing faint. We see. Not don't, not align, just the verb. The weight of it pressed on my chest. Who? What? The mirrors? The tower? The desert? The notebook trick. Back in the trailer, I dropped into the chair, notebook still open on the desk. My last line read, Scorch, Service Road, 0.9 meter radius. Below it, new graphite strokes, same pencil, same pressure, but not mine. Next hour, it answers back. I stared at the words until my teeth hurt. The hour turns. By 1:59, the pyrheliometer read 2.4 W per meter square. The receiver was at 174 degrees Fahrenheit. The south tank crown sat above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, steaming like a tea kettle that didn't remember water. When the hour rolled to 2, the field didn't jerk. It flowed. 10,000 mirrors slid a fraction higher, smoother than any motor grid I'd ever commanded. The desert had stopped pretending. Hour 4 was coming, and it wouldn't be quiet.
2:03 a.m. The plant had stopped pretending to be machinery. It felt like a body now, each mirror a lung, each actuator a tendon, and I was inside it. The pyrheliometer reported 2.9 watts per meter squared, climbing with steady patience. Not sun level, not even moonlight level, but wrong enough that my scalp prickled. The receiver skin temp ticked over 180 degrees Fahrenheit. That's cooking range. For a system that should have been dead since the last lawsuit, it was breathing. The desert's pressure. The desert has a weight at night. Usually it sits light, dry, spread thin. Tonight it leaned on me. My ears popped, not from altitude, but from pressure. The kind you feel before a thunderhead breaks open.
The air smelled of green again, crushed stems, cut grass. The plant was exhaling life it didn't have. The burned mark. At 2:11, walking toward the east fence, my flashlight beam caught another burn, this one on the sand itself. A circle maybe 6 feet across, grains melted into glossy black glass. I crouched. The glass wasn't smooth. It rippled like frozen water. Inside it, faint lines spidered outward, fractal and branching. My hand shook as I traced them. It looked like a map of the heliostat field itself, perfect down to the sectors. I snapped a picture. The flash showed me something else. My reflection on the glass surface was delayed, like it lagged half a second behind my movement. The voice returns. The radio crackled again, this time not static, words. We see back. I froze, pulse in my throat. It wasn't my name. It wasn't an order. It was an answer. I forced myself to press transmit. Who is speaking? Identify. Static. Then laughter. Not loud, not cartoonish. Just the smallest closed-mouth chuckle, stretched too long. The receiver glows. By 2:20, the receiver wasn't hiding anymore. The shimmer had thickened into a visible bruise-colored glow, crawling across the panel like ink spreading in fabric. Dust rearranged again, this time not letters, but a symbol. 3 circles connected by lines drawn in glowing soot across the shroud. It pulsed faintly with each tilt of the mirrors. I didn't recognize it. Wasn't math, wasn't electrical schematic, wasn't anything a human engineer would draw. The mirrors hum. At 2:31, wind stirred through the field. Not enough to move steel, but enough to skate sand across glass. The heliostats responded. They hummed. Thousands of panels sang one note, then doubled into a second. My teeth ached. My bones vibrated. The field was tuning itself. And I swear the hum formed syllables, not words, not yet, just the shape of language trying out its throat. The log writes again. Back in the trailer at 2:47, my notebook waited open. Another line in the same hand I hadn't written myself. Next hour, you hear it clear. I slammed the book shut, but the pencil rolled off the desk by itself, hitting the floor with a little tick, like the mirrors had kept rhythm for me. The hour turns. At 2:59, the field shifted again. The glass faces tilted higher, now pointing almost due east, as though following something rising just under the horizon. The glow on the receiver pulsed once, brighter than before. The symbol etched in soot flared and held steady, breathing like a heartbeat. When the aviation light blinked off, I thought I saw shadows in the control room glass behind me. Figures sitting in the chairs watching me work. But the room was empty when I turned. The hour ended with a sentence that wasn't mine, whispered through the radio in a voice that could have been 5 people speaking at once. We answer.
3:03 a.m.
The desert had grown restless. You can feel when a place stops being empty, it leans in on you. Every step I took crunched too loud. Every breath tasted like copper and wet leaves. The pyrheliometer screamed a new number. 3.8 W per square meter at 3:05. Impossible at night. That's the kind of stray energy you get from a hazy sunrise. And the receiver skin temp? 192 degrees Fahrenheit. It was cooking itself alive with starlight and dust. The shadow that shouldn't exist. At 3:09, I noticed a second shadow. My own body cast one from the tower's red aviation beacon, but next to it lay another, thinner, stretching at a different angle. Something else was shining. I turned east. The mirrors all faced one patch of sky. It was empty. No star brighter than 10th magnitude. No plane, no moon. Yet the sand under my boots carried a long, pale shadow, drawn by nothing. The first shape. By 3:17, the glass hummed again. The heliostats didn't just tilt, they quivered, micro-stepping in place as if waiting for a cue. I lifted the IR camera. On the screen, faint threads of heat converged upward, forming not just filaments this time, but an outline, a curved arc in the sky, like the bottom of a circle. The field was sketching something above us, burning it into air molecules. The tank stirs louder. At the south molten salt tank, the halo of steam was thicker, blowing sideways like breath. The crown temp ticked 118 degrees Fahrenheit. That's not warm metal, that's organ-level heat. I pressed my palm to the shell. It throbbed like a pulse. The glass on the ground. At 3:26, I walked back to the earlier scorched circle on the road. It had changed. No longer a smooth disk. Now etched across its surface were concentric rings, each rippling like tree growth rings, but glowing faintly blue under my flashlight. I crouched low, and for a moment I swear the rings moved outward, like ripples on water. When I leaned closer, my own reflection blinked back at me, half a second late again, but this time the eyes weren't mine. The voices multiply. The radio flared again. Not one voice now, but dozens, layered and ragged, as though a whole stadium whispered through static. Miguel, we rise. I clutched the mic, throat dry. I asked, what rises? The reply was just laughter. Not cruel, worse, pleased. The tower responds. At 3:41, letters reshaped on the receiver shroud. The soot and dust rearranged themselves with each pulse of heat. The new phrase was short, sharp, undeniable. Look up. Against my better judgment, I did. The sky betrays itself. The empty patch east-northeast shimmered. At first, it looked like bad eyesight, a float, a smudge. Then it sharpened. A faint, enormous arc of pale light stretched horizon to horizon. Not aurora, not cloud, not anything Earth owns. The mirrors were following it as it crawled higher. They were aligned to a shape no telescope charted. The hour turns. At 3:59, the hum from the field reached a peak. The heliostats leaned up, glass angled like 10,000 worshippers lifting their faces. The glow in the sky thickened into a curve of a circle. Too big, too slow, too deliberate to be a trick. The last thing the hour gave me was a sentence whispered through the mirror's vibration, bone deep, like it came from the ground under my boots. We are almost here.
4:03 a.m. The desert didn't feel like desert anymore. It felt like the inside of a machine, one too large to understand. Every step I took seemed to echo longer than it should. Even my breath sounded recorded, like something else was playing it back a second later. The pyralhiometer chirped again, 4.6 watts per meter squared. That's a sunrise level reading, but it was pitch black. The receiver temp, 208 degrees F, higher than it had been during test runs when the plant still lived. The sky finishes its sketch. At 4:10, I pointed the IR camera east. What I saw froze me. The arc from before had connected with itself. 10,000 heat filaments rose from the heliostats and stitched together a circle in the sky. To the naked eye, it was faint, like pale smoke against stars. On infrared, it was a perfect ring of light, 30 degrees wide, pulsing like a pupil contracting. The mirrors weren't just tracking anymore. They were summoning geometry. The second burn mark. On the northern service road, another scorch appeared. This one wasn't round. It was a line, straight as a laser, melted into asphalt for at least 20 feet. When I crouched to measure, the ground burned through my gloves. The line pointed due east, directly toward the glowing circle. I wrote it down, but my handwriting was shaking so bad I barely recognized it. The figures in reflection. At 4:21, I caught movement in the trailer window. My reflection was there, but it wasn't alone. Behind me sat rows of figures, shadow thin, shoulders bent, faces blurred as if underwater. I spun around. The chairs were empty, only the hum of the servers. But when I turned back to the glass, they were still sitting there, watching me. The tank pulses. The South molten salt tank was beating. That's the only word. The steel shell throbbed like a muscle. The crown temp surged past 132 degrees F. The sound it made wasn't steam anymore. It was a low thoom, in sync with the mirror's movement. I realized with a cold twist in my gut, the tanks weren't just warming, they were listening. The sky speaks. At 4:33, the circle of light pulsed once, hard. The hum from the mirrors rose to a full chord, 3 notes stacked in harmony. My knees nearly buckled. It wasn't sound, it was pressure. And then words came, not from the radio this time, not from the notebook, from the sky itself. Low, stretched, heavy. Me, guel, drawn out across the circle, spoken without a mouth. The message on the receiver. The receiver shroud glowed brighter, symbols etching deeper into soot. The 3 circles I'd seen before now multiplied, overlapping, twisting into something like an eye. Dust fell off the metal in showers, drifting around me like snow. My lamp caught it, and the flakes glittered pale blue. Across the shroud, one phrase burned clear enough to sting my eyes. The circle holds. The hour turns. 4:59 a.m. The pyralhiometer screamed at 5.1 watts per meter squared. The receiver temp leapt to 220 degrees F. The circle overhead had stopped growing. It was whole now, closed. And in its faint inner glow, I thought I saw shapes moving inside it, like shadows pacing a window. When the hour ended, the radio whispered 5 words in a voice that didn't care if I understood or not. The gate is almost ready. 5:03 a.m. The desert air was too heavy for dawn. Normally, before sunrise, the sky softens, the air cools, and shadows lose their edges. Not tonight.
The air pressed against my chest like water pressure at the bottom of a pool. Breathing felt like borrowing. The perheliometer jumped again, 6.0 W/M2. By rights, that's early morning light, but the eastern horizon was still ink black. The receiver temp, 243 degrees F, beyond spec, beyond sanity. The circle's heart. At 5:10, I lifted the IR camera to the ring overhead. Until then, it had been a pale bruise, heat smeared across the sky. Now it wasn't empty. Inside the circle, shadows moved. At first, they looked like turbulence, as if hot air distorted the stars. Then the turbulence leaned, lengthened, paced. I realized these weren't distortions. They were forms. Not clear, not human, but deliberate. Something was walking inside the circle. The field reacts. The mirrors ticked in unison again, tens of thousands of tiny stepper motors agreeing on a single micro-shift. Each glass face tilted slightly inward, as though bowing to the thing above. The hum returned, not random vibration now. Tones stacked into a chord, deep enough to rattle my ribs. I thought I heard words hidden inside the resonance. Not English, not any language I knew, just syllables forming and unforming, like a crowd chanting underwater. The tank's vision. At the molten salt tank, steam poured thicker. Its metal shell had reached 156 degrees F, but it wasn't the heat that stopped me cold. The surface of the tank had gone reflective. Not shiny steel, more like a mirror of water. And in that reflection, the glowing circle above wasn't faint. It was blazing bright, too bright to stare at directly. In the tank's reflection, the shadows inside the ring weren't vague anymore. They had faces, not human, not alien, recognizable faces. People I knew, my father long dead, my old crew chief, friends I hadn't seen in years. Each face pressed close to the liquid shine, mouths moving without sound. I staggered back. The reflection held them even after I looked away. The voice becomes many. At 5:27, the radio came alive. Not static, not one voice, a chorus. We see you. We wait. You called. I dropped the mic like it burned, but the words didn't stop. They kept coming, now whispered in the hum of the mirrors, now scrawled faintly across the shroud. You opened. The burned pattern. Near the perimeter fence, the sand itself had fused into glass. This time not a circle, not a line. A grid. Perfect squares, sharp-edged, glowing faintly in moonless dark. It matched the heliostat layout. The desert was copying itself in molten glass. The circles reply. At 5:43, the shapes inside the ring turned, not random drifting anymore. They faced downward. I don't know how I knew, but I knew. They were looking at me. The cord from the mirrors grew until it became unbearable, and then dropped to silence so sudden it made my ears ring. The radio filled the void with 3 words in a calm, flat voice, as if read from a script. The gate opens. The hour turns. By 5:59, the perheliometer read 6.7 W/M2. The receiver temp screamed past 260 degrees F. The south tank rattled like something was inside it, knocking to get out. And in the circle, the shadows pressed closer to the edge, like faces against glass.
The aviation beacon blinked once, twice. On the third blink, the circle above flashed, just enough for me to see an outline of a hand pressed against its inner rim. When the light returned, the stars behind the circle were gone, eaten.
6:03 a.m. The desert night should have been thinning by now. Dawn usually loosens its grip by 6. The horizon paling, stars retreating. Not tonight. The horizon stayed black, the stars held their ground, and the circle in the sky pulsed like a second moon that wasn't supposed to exist. The pyrheliometer screamed, 7.8 W per meter squared, almost full sunrise levels, but the sun was nowhere near the horizon. The receiver temp, 281 degrees F. Steel doesn't lie. The plant was running itself. The circle presses down. At 6:09, I felt it, not saw, felt. The circle overhead pushed on the air like a lid lowering over the desert. My knees bent under the weight. The mirrors ticked as one, faces angling steeper as if they were trying to hold the circle up. For a moment, I believed the field wasn't just tracking it. The field was keeping it in place. The first crack. At 6:14, the impossible happened. The circle split. Not wide, not even visibly obvious, but on infrared, I saw a fracture across its surface, like glass spiderwebbing from a hairline break. From that line, pale light spilled downward. It wasn't starlight, it wasn't moonlight. It was too white, too thick, like liquid poured through a crack. Where it touched the sand, the ground hissed and steamed. The south tank's knock. At 6:21, the south molten salt tank answered. A dull bang from inside the steel shell rattled the pipes. Then another, like fists. I pressed my ear against the warm curve. Inside, muffled but distinct, a voice. Open. I jerked back so fast I tripped over my own boots. My heart hammered so hard I thought it would join the tank's rhythm. The figures show their faces. By 6:29, the shadows inside the circle were clearer, not vague turbulence anymore, outlines of bodies, dozens, maybe hundreds, pacing close to the fracture. They weren't human, too tall, limbs too long, heads carried wrong. But their faces flickered, changing. One moment strangers, the next familiar people. My father again, my old crew chief, then strangers with eyes like I'd known them in dreams. I whispered without realizing it, "You're not real." The circle pulsed in reply, a low thrum in my bones. The burn pattern expands. On the service road, the earlier scorched circle had spread. No longer 3 feet, now 20, and not a circle anymore, an ellipse stretching toward the tower base. The asphalt bubbled quietly, as if boiling from heat pouring through cracks no one else could see. The receiver spoke in symbols. At 6:43, I lifted my lamp to the receiver shroud. The soot had rearranged again. Not words this time, a spiral drawn over the entire southeast panel. The spiral's center pointed east, directly to the fracture in the circle above. And as I stared, the spiral moved, not dust, not heat shimmer. The soot itself rotated slowly, clockwise, grinding against the steel like ink bleeding in water. The hour turns. 6:59 a.m. The pyrheliometer registered 8.4 W per meter squared. The receiver crossed 300 degrees F. The fracture in the circle widened, spilling more pale light. I thought I heard screams inside it, not pained, not angry, excited, like a crowd about to surge through a stadium gate. The radio whispered one last word before the hour ended. Almost. And then the static cut back in, humming like a satisfied breath.
7:03 a.m. By now, the desert should have been bleeding into dawn, but the east was still black, a hollow canvas with the circle burning in it. The stars around the rim were fading, not from sunrise, but because the light bleeding through the crack was erasing them. The pyrheliometer screeched a reading I'd never seen at night, 9.7 W per meter square. Receiver skin temp, 327 degrees Fahrenheit, past operating threshold. If this plant were alive, alarms would have been redlining. Instead, silence, except for the hum of 10,000 mirrors holding their faces to the fracture. The falling threads. At 7:08, pale threads of light spilled lower from the circle. Not beams, not clean shafts, more like ropes weaving down. They drifted slow as spider silk. Where the first thread touched the desert floor, the sand vitrified instantly. A circle of glass 10 feet wide, steaming in the cool air. The glow spread outward, crawling like roots through the ground. I staggered back, boots crunching hot shards. My soul smoked. The first burn on skin. At 7:14, a thread brushed me. Just the edge, no brighter than moonlight to the eye. My skin screamed. The back of my hand blistered in seconds, red rising under the glove. It wasn't heat like fire. It was heat like radiation, inside out, marrow deep. I bit back a yell, wrapped my hand, logged it anyway. First direct contact, burns without flame. The tanks breathing. The south molten salt tank shook hard enough to rattle bolts, each knock lined up with a pulse from the circle overhead. And then the impossible again. Steam poured out of seams, real steam. The gauge hit 212 degrees Fahrenheit and held like a heartbeat. When I leaned close, a low whisper came through the vent. Not words, breath that smelled green. The faces in the crack. At 7:26, the fracture widened further. The shadows inside pressed closer. Now I saw them clearer. Tall, two thin figures moving in jerks. But their faces shifted every time I blinked. My father's, my crew chief's, a stranger's, my own, grinning back at me with teeth too sharp. The hum from the field deepened. It didn't sound like vibration anymore. It sounded like a chant. The receiver's spiral moves. The soot spiral on the receiver span faster, clockwise now, each rotation grinding dust off the steel. Sparks fell from the seams like embers shaken from a torch. And across the spiral, letters burned themselves in glowing ash. You opened, we come. The burn pattern grows. On the North Service Road, the earlier lips had spread. Now it wasn't a shape, it was a map. Perfect lines of glass traced the entire heliostat field in miniature. The scorch marks were drawing what the mirrors already were. But in the center of the map, a new circle burned brighter. A circle not on any blueprint. A place under the desert itself.
The hour turns. By 7:59, the pyrheliometer hit 11.1 W per meter square. The receiver skin read 351 degrees Fahrenheit. The circle's crack yawned wide enough that pale light fell in steady curtains, striping the desert. Every curtain that touched earth left glass. Every glass patch hummed faintly, like it remembered the mirror's song. The radio came alive as the hour broke. Not whispers this time, a full voice, calm, deliberate, in perfect English. The gate is open.
8:03 a.m. By now the desert should have been warming with real dawn. The first edge of the sun should have been cutting across the horizon, washing the black away. But the horizon stayed drowned in shadow. It was as if the sun had been erased. Instead, the only light came from above, the circle with its fracture now yawning wider, bleeding pale curtains downward. The pyrheliometer shrieked again, 12.8 watts per meter squared. Receiver skin temp 378 degrees Fahrenheit. Numbers too absurd to process. I stopped writing them as facts and started writing them like confessions. The gate's first breath. At 8:09, the circle moved, not rotated, not widened, moved. The fracture pulsed outward, and the curtains of light shifted with it. The air itself thickened, and for the first time I felt it, inhalation. The circle dragged air upward, a giant unseen lung pulling the desert into itself. Sand swirled off the ground, pulled skyward in spirals. My own breath caught in my chest, pulled thin like the circle was testing how much it could take. Then it exhaled. The blast of air bent the mirrors a fraction backward. My ears popped. The entire desert exhaled with it. The tanks join in. At 8:16, both molten salt tanks thudded in sync. The north one had been silent until now, but suddenly it joined the rhythm. Steam burst from the vents like sighs. Condensate streaked the steel in rivulets. Both tanks hummed as though they'd been tuned. When I pressed my ear to the south tank, I heard it, deep inside the steel, a heartbeat answering the circle's rhythm. The voices form. The radio crackled with more than whispers this time. Distinct syllables formed. "Miguel, breathe with us." My stomach flipped. I spat into the dirt just to prove I still belonged to myself, but the hum pressed closer, voices layered inside it, repeating the word over and over until my own lungs stuttered to match their tempo. I ripped the radio from my collar and threw it into the dust. It still hissed, still called me, muffled and patient. The burn expands underground. At 8:27, the scorch map of the field shifted again. Glass veins that had traced the heliostat grid now drilled downward. Fused sand split open, cracks running deep, glowing faint orange like magma veins. I crouched to peer inside one fissure. A smell rose out, not sulfur, not earth. Green again, cut stems, fresh leaves. The smell of spring inside hell. The circle's edge breaks. At 8:34, the fracture tore wider. The edges curled back, ragged, glowing like hot iron. Through it, I saw shapes pressing forward, now clearer than before. Tall, thin, limbs jointed wrong. Dozens of them, all pressing their faces against the inside of the crack, like prisoners against glass. One raised a hand and pressed its palm outward. My chest seized. The shape of that hand was mine. The spiral unlocks. On the receiver shroud, the spiral of soot rotated faster until it blurred into a black whirlpool. Sparks spat out, and the letters shifted again,
burned into the dust by invisible heat. Inhale, exhale, open. As I read it, the circle above exhaled again, blasting hot wind across the desert, carrying with it faint voices not my own. The hour turns. By 8:59, the pier heliometer spat 14.2 watts per meter squared. The receiver skin temp, 404 degrees Fahrenheit. The gate wasn't just light anymore, it was breathing. And every breath made the tanks throb harder, the ground crack wider, the mirrors bowed deeper. When the aviation light blinked, the radio hissed one last phrase for the hour, calm as scripture. Now you breathe with us. And as I looked down, my own chest rose and fell in time with the circle's inhale. Not my choice, not my rhythm.
9:03 a.m. By now, dawn should have been unstoppable. But the eastern horizon was still strangled in black, as if the sun had been swallowed. The only illumination came from the fractured circle overhead, its pale curtains painting the desert in unnatural stripes of white. The pyrheliometer shrieked, 15.8 watts per meter square. Receiver skin temp, 432 degrees Fahrenheit. The molten salt tanks both roared with steam, venting like angry beasts. And through it all, the circle above widened. The gate tears wider. At 9:09, the fracture split again, stretching a ragged mouth across the sky. From it light spilled not as threads now, but as cascades, liquid, falling in sheets, washing the air with brightness that burned without flame. Where the first cascade touched the ground, a perfect trench of glass carved itself into the sand. The smell was ozone and scorched green. The tanks reply. At 9:14, the south tank cracked. A seam split down its length with a thunderclap, and instead of molten salt, a column of steam blasted upward, straight into the cascade. The cascade bent. For a second, it connected tank and circle like an umbilical cord. I stumbled backward, watching as the tank's heartbeat synced with the gate. The first form. At 9:21, one of the shadows inside the circle leaned closer. Its outline sharpened against the glowing crack. It pressed its hand outward again, the long fingers warping in the light. And then, slowly, painfully, it pierced the veil. The hand emerged, thin, too long, pale as milk poured in water. Fingers flexed against the desert air. Each joint bent wrong, folding backward before correcting itself. When it clenched into a fist, every mirror in the field ticked once, like applause. The burn on the ground. At 9:29, where the hand's shadow fell, the sand blackened instantly. Another scorched circle, but this one wasn't empty. Inside it, the glass rippled, shapes forming. I leaned close and recoiled. The glass reflected me, but not me. My face twisted into a smile I wasn't wearing. The voices align. The radio didn't whisper this time. It commanded, "Open." The word came layered in dozens of voices, male and female, young and old, in sync. The hum of the mirrors sang the same word. Even the tanks hissed it in their steam bursts. Open, open, open. The first step. At 9:37, the hand was followed by an arm, a long, pale arm, thin as scaffolding, then a shoulder. The figure pulled itself forward, each motion jerky like a puppet. Half its body slipped through the fracture, its head last. When it emerged, I saw its face clearly for the first time. And it was mine. My face, my mouth, my eyes, only smiling, wide, wrong. It tilted its head at me like a mirror testing my reflection. The hour turns. By 9:59, more hands pressed at the fracture. The first figure crouched on the desert floor, steam rising around its feet where the sand boiled. The pyrheliometer shrieked, 17.2 watts per meter square. The receiver crossed 457 degrees Fahrenheit. And as the hour ended, the first figure leaned close to me, and in my own voice it whispered, "We've arrived."
10:03 a.m. If the desert had a sun, I'd forgotten it. The sky was still black, the horizon locked away. The circle overhead blazed brighter, its fracture now wide enough for shapes to slip through whole. The pyrheliometer blared 19.1 W by M squared, receiver skin temp 482 degrees Fahrenheit. Numbers belonged to noon, not midnight, yet the world sat drowned in false night. The first one watches. The first figure, my double, still crouched in the glassed sand, grinning at me with my own teeth. Its eyes didn't blink. It tilted its head at every breath I took, like sinking to my lungs. And when I scratched my bandaged hand, it lifted its own, unbandaged, whole, and mimicked me. A mirror correcting me, not the other way around. The parade begins. At 10:11, more hands pushed through the fracture. Dozens, fingers too long, skin too pale. They crawled forward, jerking like marionettes, pulling bodies behind them. Each one, when its face emerged, carried a different mask. I saw my father's grin, my old crew chief's scowl, faces of classmates, strangers from grocery lines, a lover I buried years ago. Every one of them turned their head towards me, smiled wide, and whispered in sync, "Miguel." The scorch expands. The desert floor writhed. Where each figure stepped, sand fused into glass, leaving behind prints that glowed faint blue. By 10:19, the scorches weren't just circles or grids. They stretched into lines, processional paths radiating outward from the tower. I climbed onto the slab and looked down. From above, the burns drew a spiral, echoing the one etched on the receiver shroud. The tanks answer. At 10:27,
Both molten salt tanks thundered like drums. Steam belched upward, sucked into the cascade of light. For a second, the whole plant pulsed with a single rhythm. Mirror hum, tank knock, radio hiss, and my heartbeat fused. The first figure smiled wider, tilting its head in time. The mirror choir. The heliostats began to move, not just tilt, but oscillate, back and forth like choral singers swaying. The sound they made resolved into words, stretched, distorted, layered, but words. We are many. We are yours. The sound pressed so hard against my ribs I had to sit down. The gate floods. At 10:39, the fracture tore further. Pale cascades poured down like a waterfall. Figures spilled through, not one, not 10, hundreds. They moved awkwardly, twitching in the light, but their faces were steady. Faces I knew, faces I forgotten, faces that weren't mine, but looked like they could have been. They fanned out across the desert floor, stepping into the scorch lines, filling the spiral. The hour turned. By 10:59, the pyrheliometer screamed 21.3 W by M squared. Receiver temp soared past 510 degrees Fahrenheit. The desert floor was covered in glass paths now, glowing faintly. Figures walked them in slow processions, circling the tower, their mouths moving in soundless chants. And as the hour closed, the first one, my double, stood tall, raised its hand, and in my voice said, "Now we begin."
11:03 a.m. The horizon should have been on fire with daylight by now, but the world stayed drowned in black. The only glow came from the widening fracture in the circle above. It hung like a wound in the sky, bleeding pale light that had weight, taste, and heat. The pyrheliometer screamed again, 23.4 WM squared. Receiver skin temp, 537 degrees Fahrenheit. The plant was alive beyond capacity, and I was watching it dream itself into something else. The procession. At 11:08, the figures stopped spilling randomly from the gate. Their movements snapped into order. They filed into the scorch lines, one by one, stepping into grooves of glowing glass. Each path curved inward, linking, winding tighter around the tower. From above, it would have looked like a spiral galaxy made of bodies. Their steps were jerky, uneven, but synchronized. Each footfall landed with the hum of the mirrors, a bass note pounding through sand and bone. By 11:15, I counted dozens near the slab. Every face was a mask, my family, my friends, strangers I only half recognized. Each one turned toward me as it passed, smiling wide with too many teeth, before returning to its march. One face froze me cold, my own again, but this time scarred. A burn across the cheek I didn't have, a bandage on its hand where mine blistered. It winked. The spiral tightens. At 11:22, the march reached full cadence. Hundreds of them circled the tower, spiral tightening with each rotation. The ground glowed hotter under their steps. The scorch maps widened, joining into an enormous living diagram of the receiver's spiral. When I climbed higher up the tower to see, I realized the field wasn't just mirroring the sky. It was carving a lock. The tanks roar. At 11:31, both molten salt tanks roared like animals. Steel strained, bolts screamed, and steam shot skyward in columns that bent toward the fracture. The cascade of pale light drank the steam in. It shimmered brighter, and I swore I saw shapes swimming inside it like fish in a current. The voices in chorus. The radio shrieked into life again, but this time it wasn't whispers or single words. It was an entire chorus, voices layered, thousands speaking together. We march, we return, you called, you open. Each phrase struck like a hammer, echoing in the hum of the mirrors, in the beat of the tanks, in the scorched spirals. The desert reflects. At 11:46, I noticed the ground no longer just burned where they stepped. It reflected. Every patch of glass mirrored not the figures marching on it, but the circle above. Multiple, smaller reflections, each showing the fracture wider than it looked in the real sky. It was like the desert was rehearsing the gate, copying it, making more of it. The hour turns. By 11:59, the spiral of bodies had reached its inner coil, directly beneath the tower. The first one, my double, stood at the very center of the spiral, head tilted, watching me from below. The pyrheliometer hit 25.6 Wm squared. The receiver skin temp reached 563 degrees Fahrenheit. And as the hour ended, the circle above pulsed once, sending a shock wave of pale light across the desert. The figures all stopped in unison, turned their heads toward me, and in my own voice, they all spoke as one. The march is complete.
The desert felt like a sealed chamber. Noon should have burned the air dry and bright, but the sky was still drowned in false night. The circle overhead pulsed wider, its fracture glowing like a furnace door forced ajar. The pyrheliometer screamed again, 27.9 watts per meter squared. Receiver skin temp, 588 degrees Fahrenheit. The plant had become an engine for something that wasn't electricity. The spiral as a lock. At 12:08, the marching figures froze, hundreds of them, locked in their spiral formation around the tower. Each one stood perfectly still, heads tilted upward at the circle. From above, the scorched spiral on the ground glowed brighter, every line alive with molten light. It looked less like a path now, and more like the teeth of a keyhole. The realization struck me cold. The spiral wasn't random. It was a lock. The figures change. By 12:16, the faces of the figures began to flicker. Not one mask at a time anymore. Each face cycled, father, friend, lover, stranger, myself, like a projector skipping frames. When they turned to me in unison, every face aligned, every one of them wore my own.
hundreds of my smiles, hundreds of my eyes staring back. The receiver unlocks. At 12:24, the spiral etched on the receiver shroud rotated violently. Dust sloughed off in chunks, exposing raw steel. Sparks showered downward. Then, with a groan that rattled the tower, the spiral stopped and clicked, a sound too sharp, too mechanical to be anything but a lock turning. The cascade of light from the circle brightened, aimed, and funneled straight into the receiver dish. The tanks shatter. At 12:31, the north molten salt tank gave way. Its shell split open like fruit, spilling not salt, but blinding white liquid. It hissed against the sand, turning whole dunes to glass. The south tank trembled in response, its heartbeat sinking with the figure's chant. Steam roared skyward in a column so thick that it painted the fracture with condensation. And inside the mist, shapes leaned closer. The key revealed. By 12:39, the spiral of bodies began to move again, only this time inward. Step by step, the hundreds walked toward the tower's base. Their steps glowed the ground brighter, feeding light into the spiral pattern. The desert itself began to hum. I climbed 2 more levels of the stair, looking down. The spiral blazed white now, and the tower stood in its center like a key waiting in a lock. The plant wasn't just part of the event, it was the key. The voices in unison. At 12:46, the voices didn't whisper anymore. They shouted, "Turn! Turn! Turn!" The field of mirrors obeyed, every heliostat ratcheted in unison, angles shifting eastward, then inward. The hum of steel on steel screamed like an enormous gear grinding into place. The desert itself vibrated, heat blurring the air into a haze. The hour turns. By 12:59, the pyroheliometer hit 29.5 W per meter squared. Receiver skin temp 510 degrees Fahrenheit. The figures all froze again, spiral blazing around them. The circle above pulsed one more time, stretching wider than ever before. And as the hour ended, my notebook wrote itself in lines I could barely read through shaking. The lock is set. Now the key turns.
1:03 p.m. The desert floor glowed like a forge. The spiral of scorched glass pulsed beneath my boots, brighter each time the circle overhead exhaled. The heat shimmer blurred the figures marching until they looked less like bodies and more like flames given human outlines. The pyroheliometer shrieked again, 31.2 W per square meter. Receiver skin temp, 634 degrees Fahrenheit. Numbers so absurd, I stopped logging them as data. I wrote them as warnings instead. The spiral begins to turn. At 1:09, the ground itself shifted. The scorched spiral, miles wide, etched in glowing glass, rotated. Not metaphorically. The desert crust moved, turning slowly clockwise, like gears grinding under my feet. The figures stepped in perfect time with the motion, their jerks synchronized into a single wave. It wasn't just a spiral anymore. It was a key turning. The towers cry. By 1:16, the receiver shroud screamed, not mechanically, vocally.
The grinding of its metal echoed through the desert like a cry torn from a throat. The spiral etched on its panels spun faster, sparks jetting off into the air. And when it stopped, the same sound came, a sharp click, like a lock releasing. The tower wasn't resisting, it was obeying. The figures merge. At 1:22, the doubles began to blur. Their faces flickered too fast to parse. My father, my lover, my chief, strangers, myself, and then they overlapped. Bodies twisted, merging into each other, forming larger shapes. One of them stretched 15 feet high, a column of faces stacked on faces, arms bent like branches. It bent toward me, and every mouth whispered in sync, "You are the hinge." The tanks collapsed. At 1:31, the south tank ruptured. Steel peeled open like paper. Instead of salt, a torrent of light blasted upward, straight into the fracture. The gate shuddered. The fracture spread wider, spilling a storm of white haze. I stumbled, clutching the railing as the ground beneath my boots shook. The spiral beneath me had become a gear, teeth grinding, light spilling from the cracks. The circle shifted. By 1:38, the circle overhead wasn't just hanging anymore. It turned. The fracture rotated, sinking with the spiral below. Above and below, two enormous gears, sky and earth, clicked into the same rhythm. My head filled with pressure so strong I nearly vomited. Inside the hum, voices rose, thousands strong, chanting, "Turn, turn, turn." The first opening. By 1:48, the fracture tore open wide enough to swallow a mountain. Inside, no more shadows, no turbulence, just light, endless, crushing, pure white light, spilling like a sea pressing against glass. It wasn't coming through, not fully. The lock was still turning, but with every degree the pressure grew, bending the world around it. The horizon wavered, the stars blinked out one by one. The hour turns. By 1:59, the Pyre heliometer screeched 33.6 W per square meter. Receiver skin temp 661 degrees Fahrenheit. The spiral finished its first rotation. The tower groaned and clicked, slotting into some invisible mechanism. The figures froze again, all at once, then tilted their heads up. Hundreds of my faces, all staring at the blazing fracture. And the voice that spoke through them wasn't fragmented anymore. It was whole. The key has turned.
2:03 p.m. The spiral beneath me glowed like molten iron, every line alive, every scorched groove lit from within. The desert floor vibrated with a pulse that wasn't seismic, it was mechanical, like teeth grinding in an unseen machine. The perheliometer shrieked a new number, 35.1 watts per meter squared. Receiver skin temp 687 degrees Fahrenheit. The sky above wasn't sky anymore. The circle hung wide, the fracture yawning like a wound pulled open, spilling a brilliance that hurt to look at directly. The lock clicks open. At 2:09, the hum of the mirrors grew sharp. Thousands of heliostats tilted in unison, then snapped to a final angle. The sound that followed was unmistakable. A click, a lock undone. The spiral on the ground blazed white, lines bright as weld arcs, converging on the tower's base. The whole structure shuddered like it had been freed from gravity itself. The gate moves. By 2:14, the fracture in the circle did something new. It slid sideways, like two massive doors parting. Light spilled through in a sheet so thick it painted the desert in pale fire. And behind it, something moved. Not shadows this time, not faces, a mass, enormous, too big to measure. Its outline pressed against the widening gap, limbs or towers or branches, it was impossible to tell. The doubles respond. At 2:22, the figures in the spiral raised their arms together. Every single one of them wore my face. In perfect unison, they pointed upward to the fracture, and in my own voice, multiplied 1,000-fold, they shouted, "Open!" The word tore across the desert like a wave. My ears bled. The tanks collapse. At 2:29, the north tank gave out completely. Steel shrieked, bolts tore loose, and the structure folded into itself. But instead of imploding with debris, it released another torrent of blinding light that streamed straight into the fracture. The circle above pulsed, widened. The thing behind it pressed harder. The ground answers. By 2:37, cracks opened across the desert floor, glass veined outward in jagged lines, glowing hot orange. The spiral had expanded, feeding new channels. When I crouched to peer into one fissure, I saw not rock beneath, but stars, a void, as if the ground had been peeled away to reveal the night sky under our feet. The first glimpse. At 2:46, the fracture split wide enough for a head to push through. It wasn't a head like anything living. It was architecture, angles, facets, shifting planes of light stacked into each other. But it turned, it looked down, and though it had no eyes, I knew it saw me. The hour turns. By 2:59, the perheliometer screamed 37.2 watts per meter squared. The receiver burned past 711 degrees Fahrenheit. The doubles in the spiral dropped to their knees, hands raised toward the thing pushing through, and in the last breath of the hour, the voice that wasn't mine but wore my throat spoke from everywhere at once. The gate is open.
3:03 p.m. The air was wrong. It wasn't just heavy anymore. It pressed, like a hand clamping the desert flat. My lungs pulled shallow. Every breath felt stolen from someone else's rhythm. The pyrheliometer shrieked, 39.4 W per m squared. Receiver temp, 739 degrees Fahrenheit. The circle overhead was no longer a wound. It was a doorway, and something was stepping through. The first step. At 3:09, the head I'd glimpsed, facets of light stacked on themselves like impossible architecture, pushed further,
followed by shoulders that bent wrong, unfolded and folded again. Each movement warped the air, bending horizon lines like heat haze. When its arms stretched through, pale as bone lit from within, the desert groaned. Sand shifted under its touch. Where its hand pressed, glass bloomed outward, a crater of molten shine forming instantly. The doubles in the spiral cheered with my voice. The spiral answers. By 3:17, the entire spiral of figures moved again, bowing low. Their faces flickered, all masks falling away until only one face remained, mine. Hundreds of my faces kneeling in a circle, smiling up at the thing that wore light for flesh. They chanted, teeth flashing in rhythm, "Welcome, welcome, welcome." The sound rattled my teeth from inside my skull. The tower reacts. At 3:24, the receiver dish blazed alive. The spiral engraved in its soot spun so violently that shards of steel peeled away. The tower vibrated in sync with the ground, as though the entire structure had been designed for this single act, not to capture sunlight, but to invite something through. I clung to the stair rail, watching as bolts shook loose like teeth from a jaw. The tanks finish. At 3:31, the south tank collapsed in on itself, spraying liquid white light across the ground. It didn't spill, it crawled, snaking through the scorched spirals like veins, feeding the process. The figure above bent lower, inhaling the light as though drinking steam. The gate widened with each gulp. The voice that owns my name. At 3:39, the radio, still lying broken in the sand, buzzed back to life. My own voice, calm and certain, came through. "Miguel, kneel." I didn't move, but every figure in the spiral did. My hundreds of faces dropped to their knees, pressing their foreheads to the glowing ground. The figure above reached lower, arms stretching further into the world, and for a moment I thought it was reaching for me. The first arrival. At 3:47, its foot pressed through. The ground screamed. Sand vitrified into a plate of black glass 20 yards wide, steam jetting upward in violent bursts. The weight of it cracked the spiral lines. The ground didn't collapse, it gave way, like the desert was welcoming the step. When the foot settled, the hum of the mirrors went silent for the first time in hours. And then the ground itself whispered in my bones, "It begins." The hour turns. By 3:59, the pyrheliometer blared 41.7 W per m squared. The receiver dish glowed white-hot at 764 degrees Fahrenheit. The fracture above yawned wider. More limbs pressed forward, more glass bloomed across the desert floor, and the doubles in the spiral lifted their heads, every one of them smiling my smile, chanting one word in a rhythm that shook the world. Here.
4:03 p.m. The desert no longer belonged to itself. It was bent, reshaped, pressed flat under the weight of what had come through. The air trembled, thick like syrup. Even the sand seemed slower, refusing to shift under the wind. The pyrheliometer screamed an impossible value, 44.2 watts per meter squared.
The receiver, 792 degrees Fahrenheit. No system was meant to survive this, but the plant didn't just survive, it celebrated. The second step. At 4:09, the figure lowered its other foot. The impact boomed across the spiral, glass plates fracturing, molten seams glowing hotter. The earth bowed, yet didn't crack apart. It bent like clay being shaped. Each step wasn't destruction, it was installation, something anchoring itself here. The doubles collapse. By 4:16, the spiral of my doppelgangers trembled. They fell forward, faces pressed into the scorched ground. Some merged, bodies dissolving into light that fed the glowing lines. Others simply stopped, their shapes freezing into statues of glass. The few that remained raised their heads again, mouths open wide in silence, as though waiting for me to answer something they'd asked without words. The tower's breaking song. At 4:23, the receiver tower began to bend. Metal screamed. The spiral etched in its panels pulsed with fire. Every bolt shot loose in sequence, clanging down the stairs. The dish tilted not toward the sun, not toward the sky, but directly at the gate. It wasn't capturing light anymore. It was transmitting. The gate widens. At 4:31, the fracture tore open into a full wound, stretching from horizon to horizon. Stars vanished behind it, erased like chalk from slate. Inside, I didn't see shadows this time. I saw depth. Miles, maybe more, an ocean of light-filled structures, alive and moving, a city or a machine or a mind too big to name, and all of it leaned forward. The ground answers back. By 4:38, the desert floor cracked in great seams, and from inside poured not magma, but light. White gold radiance that hissed like water on steel, flooding upward, joining the cascade from above. For the first time, the ground and sky weren't separate. They were the same mouth, opening wider. The voice returns. At 4:46, my radio, shattered, bent, spoke clearly. My own voice again, calm, certain, final. Miguel, step forward, complete it. I shook my head, clutched the stair rail until my knuckles split. But when I looked down, my double, the first one, the one that had grinned with my face, was already climbing the tower toward me. Its mouth stretched too wide, its teeth shining like glass. The hour turns. By 4:59, the pyroheliometer screamed 47.0 watts per meter squared. The receiver boiled at 818 degrees Fahrenheit. The figure above pressed its hands deeper into the world, its weight undeniable, bending everything toward it. The doubles in the spiral, those still alive, raised their heads one last time, and in unison, with my voice, they said, "One more hour."
5:03 p.m. The desert was no longer ground. It was a reflection pool of light and glass, humming like a chord struck too long. The horizon was gone. North, south, east, west, everything pointed toward the gate yawning above. The pyroheliometer registered 49.6 W/m squared. The receiver's skin screamed at 842 degrees F. The tower groaned under the strain, its spiral burning like a fuse. I gripped the railing tighter.
My blood felt like it was boiling. The doppelganger's climb. At 5:09, the first double reached the stairs. My face, my eyes, my scar. It climbed without fatigue, every step echoing like it knew exactly where to place its foot. When it reached me, it didn't attack. It just smiled wider, leaned close, and whispered with my own voice. "Step forward, Miguel. This was always you." Its breath smelled like scorched metal and cut grass. The spiral of ash. By 5:17, the spiral of figures below began to collapse. Their bodies folded inward, melting into light, pouring like rivers toward the tower base. Each collapse left behind a statue of glass, frozen faces locked in grins, all of them mine. The spiral blazed brighter as their essence flowed into it. I could feel it feeding the tower, feeding the gate. The gate hungers. At 5:23, the fracture overhead pulsed. The massive figure pressing through lowered its head, closer than before. No mouth, no eyes, just planes of light shifting like plates of glass. And yet its presence pressed against my skull, whispering directly inside. One step, and the circle closes. The doubles echoed it, chanting the same phrase in my own voice. The tower tilts. By 5:31, the receiver dish finally tore loose. It groaned downward, twisting like a joint dislocating, then snapped into place, aimed perfectly at the fracture. The dish didn't capture, it projected. A column of white fire speared into the gate, binding earth to sky. The gate widened again, trembling like it was alive. The voice inside me. At 5:39, something broke in my chest. Not bone, not muscle, something deeper. A second heartbeat began, syncing with the hum. My breaths no longer belonged to me. Each inhale matched the circle's inhale. Each exhale followed the spiral's glow. And then my own voice slipped from my throat without my permission. Almost complete. The words weren't mine, but my mouth smiled when I said them. The doppelganger's hand. At 5:47, my double reached out. Its hand, my hand, smoldered with pale light. It didn't pull me, it offered. For a moment, I wanted to take it. The desert, the gate, the voices, all of it pressed me toward that choice. My notebook fell open at my feet. On the page, words scrawled in the same pencil I hadn't touched. One more hour, one last step. The hour turns. By 5:59, the pyrheliometer screeched 52.0 W/M squared. The receiver boiled at 869 degrees F. The doubles below were nearly gone, melted into streams of light, feeding the spiral. The massive figure above braced both hands on the fracture's edge, preparing to pull itself fully through. And in the silence before the next hour began, every voice, radio, doubles, tower, tanks, ground, sky, spoke as one with my throat. Now, Miguel, now you decide.
6:03 p.m. The desert wasn't a desert anymore. It was glass, fire, and song. The horizon erased, the sky split open, the ground itself hollowed into light. There was no up or down, just the gate above, the spiral below, and me in between. The pyrheliometer screamed its final reading, 54.7 W to meter squared. The receiver glowed at 901 degrees Fahrenheit. Then the sensors died, needles locked, metal warped, numbers no longer mattered. Because the world had become the number, the count had ended. The doppelganger waits. At 6:08, my double stood across from me on the stair. My own eyes stared back, my own lips smiled. Its hand stayed outstretched. "One step," it said, "one step and it closes." Behind it, the spiral below had burned down to nothing but molten grooves. Every figure was gone, their bodies melted into the keyhole of glass. The tower bent lower, pointing all its force at the fracture. The gate demands. By 6:17, the massive figure bracing the fracture pressed harder. Its hands clawed wider, dragging space open like a curtain. Behind it stretched infinity, structures of light, a geometry too vast, a sea of faceless forms crowding forward. And then I heard it, not outside, not in the radio, in my skull. "Step, Miguel. Be the hinge. Open." The pressure in my chest was unbearable. My lungs wanted to match it. My heart wanted to obey. The last resistance. At 6:24, I dropped to my knees, not in worship, collapse. The stare burned my palms through my gloves. My bandaged hand throbbed. The notebook slid open again. Last lines burned into the paper by some unseen heat. "If you step, they stay. If you don't, they still come. But one way, you belong." I couldn't tell if it was warning or invitation. The doubles touch. By 6:33, the double leaned closer. Its smile was wide enough to split skin. Its hand pressed my chest. Not a push, a pulse. My heart jumped to its rhythm. I gagged, choking on air that wasn't mine. Behind it, the desert floor cracked fully open. Beneath the glass, stars, the void. Another sky waiting below. The circle collapses. At 6:41, the fracture buckled, not wider, deeper. The gate folded inward like an eye dilating, dragging light down in rivers. The massive figure braced its shoulders against the rim, pulling itself further. The first of its legs scraped through, knees bending backward, feet smashing molten craters in the sand. The doubles were gone, the spiral complete. Only I was left, facing myself. The last step. By 6:52, the choice wasn't mine anymore. My double grabbed my hand. Its grip burned but didn't blister. It pulled. I should have resisted. I didn't. My boots scraped against steel, but my body leaned forward. One step. The gate pulsed. The spiral blazed. The tower screamed. And every voice from sky to ground to my own throat shouted, "Close!" The hour turned. 6:59 p.m. The light collapsed inward. The fracture sealed in an instant, faster than a blink, crushing the massive figure halfway through. Its scream was soundless, tearing the desert air. The tower snapped in half. The tanks vaporized. The spiral glass shattered into dust. And then silence. When I opened my eyes, the desert was dark. The horizon returned. Stars pricked the sky. No circle, no fracture, no doubles. Just the ruins of the plant and the ringing in my ears. My notebook lay open in the sand. One last line written there, in my own hand, but not my memory.
The key turned, the gate will wait until you step again.